So a couple of days ago, I posted a video on the channel, and it was called something like "Key Evidence: Rewatching Kell Brook versus Gennady Golovkin and Kell Brook versus Sean Porter pre the Errol Spence fight." And in that video at the time, I promised to record a part two, where I looked at some of the old Errol Spence fights and tried to come to a conclusion as to whether some of the form, some of the attributes that he exhibited in those fights would be a key piece of evidence ahead of deciding who'd win in a potential fight with Kell Brook. So in the last few days, I've been rewatching a few Errol Spence fights. I've rewatched Chris Algieri, I've rewatched Leonard Bundu, Phil the Greco, maybe one or two others as well. And I actually see some definite patterns emerging in Errol Spence. Errol Spence, clearly a very, very good fighter. He's a fighter who, so far in his career, seems to have fought with one tactic, if you like. And that's not to say that he only has one tactic. It may be that he's only had to exhibit it against the level of opposition he's been in with. But so far in Errol Spence's young career to date, I see him as a guy who's stood off his opponents to begin with, got his southpaw jab working, tried to get himself into the fight and ease himself into the action by keeping the fight at range and throwing a long southpaw 1-2. But really, his his preferred method of destruction, if you like, is on fighting inside the pocket. He's someone who likes to control the pace from the outside for the first round or two, have a bit of a look at his opponent, get himself warmed up into the fight, and then he goes into seek and destroy mode, where he steps it up to the inside. He throws really, really, really strong hooks to the body. He throws a really tidy uppercut up the centre, and he becomes a very, very destructive fighter. And often what you'll see in Errol Spence fights is he wins rounds from distance. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he's losing rounds against these guys, but he's not destructive from the outside. What I've really seen him do is win rounds, create a lead, create some sort of comfortableness in the fight, and then step it up, bring the fight to the pocket and close the show. And typically what you find is that when he pours it on the level of opposition he's been doing on the inside, they've been wilting, and he's been able to get them out of there relatively short order. The Leonard Bundu fight, for example, which I rewatched only yesterday, the first few rounds of that fight, it's not a thrilling fight. Spence is winning easily from distance. At some point, you just feel that he's kind of made the decision that he's going to go in for the kill now. He steps it up, and really from that point onwards, you can pretty much say the fight lasts about a round until he finds a hole through Bundu's defence. Spence is big, he looks heavy-handed, he's an excellent body puncher, he's got a real range of punches in his arsenal. He's a legit heavy-handed guy, and he looks very, very talented. He looks like a talented fighter. He's an athlete in there as well. There's a lot to like about Errol Spence. What I'm trying to work out realistically is how easy it's going to be to impose that style on Kell Brook. And I think that's one of the key questions on the lead up to that fight. Just before I get into that, one thing I've got to say, and before somebody says they're nothing like, I appreciate that the fighter I'm about to name and Errol Spence do not resemble each other. Errol Spence is a southpaw. Errol Spence appears to carry more power for his weight class. There's all sorts of difference. Errol Spence is probably a better technician with a far superior amateur pedigree, and probably has better work from the outside. But fundamentally, I actually think there are some similarities between Errol Spence and Chris Eubank Jr. actually. Chris Eubank Jr. is another guy who has tended to be big for the weight class he's operated in, who's tended to be able to win rounds from distance. But really, where they're most effective and where they're most at home is when they bring the fight into the pocket. And they both bring a sort of a precision and pressure inside the pocket that really breaks people down. They're both handy with the uppercut, they're both handy with the body shot, and they go into that seek and destroy mode where they close the distance and they become relentless fighters. And I think there is some similarities there between Errol Spence and Chris Eubank Jr. Perhaps in terms of the way they approach fights, the styles that they fight, where they're most comfortable. I don't get me wrong, I think Errol Spence is probably a more complete looking fighter at this stage than Chris Eubank Jr. But I certainly think for UK fans watching this video, there's an element of that in there. Spence is someone who will have a look the first 2-3 rounds, but then he'll look to close the gap and will get involved in that kind of dogfight type atmosphere. So let's talk about potential form, and let's talk about how he can bring this style into a fight against Kell Brook. If I look about weaknesses in Errol Spence's game, I think he's got a tendency to admire his work. Often I notice that he will throw a southpaw jab and he maybe doesn't bring his hand straight back to his chin. He's a guy who, maybe it's because he's been fighting at a lower level of opposition, maybe because he's been fighting guys who aren't renowned as power punchers. His best wins are the likes of Algieri, Bundu. These are not big punchers, etc. But I think there's a tendency to stick that jab out and not bring the hand straight back. I also think there's a tendency to admire his work when he's coming onto the inside. I think that's potentially when he's most vulnerable, and I think I may have recalled this incorrectly, but I think I may have even heard Ultratech Sports say that in one of his videos in the past. But for me, Errol Spence, competent from the outside, relatively slick, relatively tidy from the outside, but sometimes he'll throw a jab, he won't bring his hand back, and he'll just step into range. And a guy like Kell Brook, who's almost got that telescopic, orthodox right-hand cross, could potentially be someone who's going to catch Errol Spence, because Brook's got good timing. Brook's shown that in the Sean Porter fight, that he can deal with an opponent rushing in quickly and he can catch them. And I do think Errol Spence kind of neglects his defence when he's coming into range. I do think he kind of is slightly open to being caught, and I think that is specifically where he's more open to being caught. The bad news for Kell Brook, as far as I'm concerned, is when I looked at the evidence in part 1 of this series, where I talked about Kell Brook versus Porter and Kell Brook versus Golovkin. For me, Kell Brook was able to deal with a guy like Porter. The pressure Porter brought was uneducated pressure. It was high volume, it was lots of pace, it was lots of aggression, but it was wide, it was inaccurate, it was just pressure for the sake of pressure. And Kell Brook was able to time it. Kell Brook was able to hold, to negate the inside game. Against a guy like Golovkin, who brought that more educated pressure, who used better angles, who mixed it up with head to body, Kell Brook couldn't deal with that and looked really, really vulnerable when he was up against the ropes. Now, I've looked at Errol Spence when he actually moves into that pocket several times, and I've got to say, I think he's Golovkin, not Sean Porter. He is not a wild guy who's going to be throwing haymakers, and who Kell Brook's simply going to be able to single punch, counter punch, and then get out of there. He has a much more educated and controlled pressure than Sean Porter was able to bring. Now, what he obviously lacks is the size advantage over Kell Brook than Golovkin. Brook and Spence both big 147 pounders, whereas Brook was obviously in unknown territory up at 160 against Golovkin. So, the fact that I'm saying stylistically on the inside he's more Golovkin than he's Porter, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be as effective as Golovkin, because there was also the size dynamic to factor into that Golovkin fight. But what I'm getting at is, I'm not sure Kell Brook is going to be able to close down Errol Spence, on the inside, like he did with Sean Porter. I kind of picture in this fight Kell Brook's tactics being like Vladimir Klitschko when he fought Alexander Povetkin. Keep him at range, utilise the jab, throw the right hand off the jab, try and hold up close, try and negate the inside game. I don't think Brook is going to be able to do that like he did against Sean Porter, or like Klitschko did against Povetkin. I think the way Spence attacks, he creates angles. I've noticed Spence, he'll put a shoulder up and kind of lean in to create an angle to go to the body. He's adept on the inside. This is a guy who has ring craft and ring savvy beyond what his professional record may suggest. Kell Brook, for me, he's never been someone who's been the most versatile fighter. I've never viewed him as an inside fighter. I've never viewed him as a body puncher. Spence is bringing those dynamics to the table massively, and really, I do believe that if we see periods of this fight where Spence is able to position Kell Brook with his back to the ropes, and Kell Brook is, eating some of that punishment and allowing Spence to unload on him, I think if that is to happen, it's going to be a very, very, very hard fight for Kell Brook to win, because I don't think Kell Brook can live with Spence on the inside, and I don't think Kell Brook can control Spence and outstrength him and pot-shot him like he did with Sean Porter. So for me, having reviewed these fights, Spence, he's just a less effective fighter on the outside. He's been winning rounds on the outside, but that's because of the level of opposition he's been in with. And the rounds he's been winning them tidily, don't get me wrong, but he's not looked the destructive beast on the outside that he has on the inside. I think Kell Brook's got an advantage from range. I think Kell Brook is the harder puncher from range. I think Kell Brook may be the more deadly operator hiding behind a long 1-2. And I think that's going to be key going into this fight. I really do. I think if Kell Brook can start strong, if Errol Spence is inclined to fight the first 2 or 3 rounds at range like he seems to in a number of his fights, and Kell Brook can take a 3-0 lead at home, I think that is a huge, huge determining factor in this fight. But as I say, for me, if the fight goes into the pocket and if Errol Spence is allowed to grind down and wear down on Kell Brook, then it's a very, very hard night's work for Kell Brook, because cutting down that weight, coming off a tough loss against Golovkin, the pressure, the pace, the body work that Spence is going to bank is going to be hard to combat. So for me, there's 3 areas of this fight. You've got long range, where Kell Brook's got an advantage. You've got short range, where Errol Spence has got a huge advantage. And then you've got mid-range. And I actually think how the fight develops in that mid-range could well be a key factor. Spence, as I say, does he admire his work? He has done in the past, but the guy is certainly possible to counterpunch when he's unloading. He's certainly easier to hit on his way in. I've compared him to a Golovkin earlier in this video. I've kind of noticed in a few fights that the way he cuts down the ring, the way he angles himself with his feet when he's coming in, isn't as advanced as Golovkin. Often what he does is he'll throw a southpaw jab and then kind of just walk into range when his opponent is still trying to block the jab. Errol Spence, there's an element of being a bit upright, maybe having a chin in the air, and if Kell Brook can sort of sniper him, if you like, can time him, can counterpunch him there, then we haven't seen Errol Spence's chin tested against a guy like Kell Brook in his career to date. So I think it's a fascinating fight. The more I watch videos of both guys, the harder I'm finding it to actually pick a winner. I'm going to have to pick a winner at some point. So I won't be sitting on the fence forever. But at the minute, I just can't do it. It's really, really fascinating. And I think as a stylistic class, this is about as good as it gets for boxing. So, I'm continuing to watch old fights for both guys. And I'm really, really looking forward to this one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section, people. How do you think Kell Brook is going to deal with the stylistic challenge of Errol Spence? If you've enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and please hit the thumbs up button to support this video and mean it will get increased visibility. Many thanks for watching again.